Greetings. Welcome to chapter 14. Can't go any farther, at least I can't, because that's where my course ends at chapter 14, where we've covered all the big ones. And this last chapter, I want to take a look at the new religions. Okay. And what is new, right, about these new religious movements? The modern era has witnessed an explosion of new religious movements, and we're going to call them NRMs. In the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, no fewer than 14,000 new religions, new religious communities have arisen, collectively testifying to the influence of three historical factors: modernization, globalization, and secularization. And many of those who have joined such communities identify themselves as seekers, that is, individuals who have distanced themselves from the established faiths, right? The established faiths, and who are open to new, often countercultural influences. So the first World Parliament of Religions in 1893 brought together a number of such communities. Communities of dissent is what they were called. And the repeal, along with that, the repeal of the Asian Exclusion Act of 1965 brought an increasing number of immigrants and cultural influences from Asia to the United States, expanding and enriching the pool of religious ideas from which non-traditional religious communities could be drawn. So some of these influences can be seen in so-called New Age communities, where such practices as channeling and astrology are common. So in this chapter, we want to achieve a comprehensive view of the growth of NRMs during the 19th through the 21st centuries, to understand how and why alternative forms of established religious creeds develop. We also want to become familiar with various social science typologies that attempt to categorize diverse religious communities and to develop an historical perspective on some of the most influential NRMs and their leadership. And then lastly, my objective to understand the social and cultural forces that promote the growth of countercultural spirituality. Let's take a look at alternative Christianities and their offshoots first. Contemporary social scientists have proposed various ways of classifying these movements. Roy Wallace, for example, he identifies religions as world affirming, world renouncing, and world accommodating. Peter Clark, however, he distinguishes between religious communities that emphasize a social transformation of the self, not found in established faiths, leading to a distinction between persons who are spiritual as opposed to those who are conventionally religious. So both of these typologies, however, are incomplete attempts to categorize and explain the profusion of NRMs in an era dominated by science and technology. One obvious and descriptive way of describing dissenting forms of Christian thought in the modern era is to refer to them as alternative Christianities. So within that expansive category, one can include such divergent communities as the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints, right? Christian Science, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Family, and the Unification Church of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, otherwise known as the Moonies. Now, several of these communities are clearly Adventist in their orientation, reflecting the influence of the Second Great Awakening. And then you have the Millerite movement of the 1840s. And at least two of these, the Family and the Unification Church, have been criticized for exhibiting elements of, one would say, a personality cult. At the furthest remove from historic Christian thought, but very much within an Adventist frame of reference. One encounters the Rastafarian movement, whose divine redeemer figure is Haile Selassie, who briefly reigned as emperor of Ethiopia in the 1930s, and whose birth name, Ras Tafari Makoun, gave this Jamaican liberation movement its name. Let's look at the rediscovery of Eastern religious thought and the revival of esoteric and neo-pagan thought. NRMs, reflecting the influence of Eastern religious thought, have in some instances achieved considerable attention and even notoriety. These include ISKCON, or the Hare Krishnas, Falun Gong, transcendental meditation, and the Maharishi movement. And all of these groups make eclectic use of Buddhist, Hindu, and Taoist principles and practices. More eclectic still, and having little in common with one another, are those NRMs, generally thought of as either esoteric or neo-pagan. I'm thinking there of the Raelian movement, Scientology, Wicca, and the Theosophical Society. Now, the Raelians, for example, they belong to a discrete segment of the UFO believing community, combining a fascination with extraterrestrials with an ardent advocacy of sexual liberation and human cloning. Wiccans, by contrast, are nature worshiping pagans who celebrate the power of the natural world and the human imagination. Violent tendencies in new religious cults. Let's take a look at that. NRMs that display an extreme world-renouncing tendency often inspire some form of violent pathological behavior. The collective suicide of members of the Heaven's Gate UFO community in 1997 provides one conspicuous example of spiritual violence that turned inward. The Shinderkro sarin gas attack upon the Tokyo subway system in 1995, however, is an even more emphatic example of how religiously inspired hatred of the world can assume the form of programmatic, externalized violence. Universalist religious thought and the new atheism. The Baha'i movement, with its roots in 19th century Iran, constitutes a dissonant monotheistic community within a region dominated by Islam. Its universalism and its belief in the prophetic stature of its spiritual leaders, chiefly Baha'u'llah, have made it an unwelcome presence within the Muslim world, and its teachings combine ideas from the three Abrahamic religions with a largely progressive ideology of gender equality and democratic governance. So similarly, Unitarian Universalism has its roots in different forms of Christianity that rejected the concept of the Trinity in the 19th century, only to gravitate toward an inclusive form of religious humanism in the 20th century, embracing many of the ethical principles of both Western and Eastern faith systems. So as a postscript to this outline of the NRM phenomenon, I'd like to note the resurgence of atheistic thought in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as a philosophical counterpoint to the obvious vitality and diversity of contemporary religious life. There is that, and that wraps up the course, the lecture part of that. Be sure to check the schedule out and make sure you have your uh, project ready to be submitted this week. And it's been great talking to you all these weeks, all these episodes. So bye-bye.